the Hope Wheel, which is a presentation by Dr. Bill Finnegan, who's Research Officer, Future of Education and Training for the Climate Education Lab in University of Oxford. If you haven't come across the Climate Education Lab, I would encourage you to have a look, because they lay on some really good seminars and some quite dodgy ones, because I gave one, but some really good seminars, and it's a really great network to be involved in. And also Cathy Deborah, who's Senior Lecturer, Education for Sustainability at Oxford Brookes University. So thank you very much, Bill and Cathy, and over to you. Thank you very much for the Hope Wheel, a working model for constructively engaging with climate change in classrooms.
Brilliant, thanks. I'll get the slides going, Cathy, while you start us off.
That's great. Thank you very much for the introduction, Liz. And it's great to be here. Such rich discussions so far in the breakout rooms and from all of the speakers. So it's a real pleasure for us both to be here. And today we're sharing with you a model called the Hope Wheel, which is hoping to distill things from across many, many different discipline areas that are all related to many of the topics we've been talking about today. So I'm going to hand over to Bill to take us through. He's going to give us a little bit of the background to the Hope Wheel and what it's about. Bill, over to you.
Great, thanks. And yes, thanks for having us. I think there's lots of echoes from the conversations we've just had and earlier today in the work we've been doing. So something to mention about this this collaboration, it's very much a work of synthesis. It kind of draws on our own research, the literature that has been influencing us, and then also our work designing and developing and delivering educational learning opportunities. It does engage with the idea of climate change as not solely a scientific problem, and sustainability more broadly, as having these layers of culture and human psychology that we need to engage with, and hope popping up, and also kind of questions of hope and optimism. What does that mean? And so in climate change education, but also in environmental education, education for sustainable development, this has been coming up, and then moving from that theory to kind of practical guidance for educators. Cathy's going to speak a little bit more about transformative learning, but just trying to find ways of again synthesizing all of this, but making it really actionable for someone who is going to be teaching in different settings. Could be formal education, could be from early years up through higher ed. It could be more informal settings like museums. So this is the Hope Wheel, and we'll kind of do a quick tour of it and then share a few examples. So to start with, I just wanted to highlight that there's 3 different elements, kind of components in the wheel in this metaphor. So we have handrails, guardrails, and lenses. So the handrails are the darker blue lines in the middle of the Hope Wheel, the spokes of the wheel. And they're essentially things to hold on to if you're an educator who's entering this space, and you might not have great confidence about how to talk about climate change in a way that could support hope, and yet you're feeling like it's an important space for you to enter. So those are things to hold on to. The guardrails are the things to be aware of, and avoid is to put it strongly, because I think having climate anxiety there, recognizing that is a valid response, as was mentioned earlier by the students, but also again keeping in mind that there are things that you don't want to make worse through your educational intervention. And then the lenses are things we layer on top that are kind of integrating concepts. And again, they're echoes of some of the earlier conversations around sustainability competencies. So to kind of walk through the details, again, you can see we layered a lot of things into this. So I'll kind of quickly go through and at least provide a simple definition of what we're talking about. So in the handrails, again, this idea of honesty, of truth about the situation, factually accurate, it being really critical. Awareness and kind of transformative learning, sustainability competencies related to self-awareness, developing that being quite important. Educators as holding a particular type of space when it comes to this that might be different than many of us are used to in terms of transferring information in more of a lecture style. We're actually doing something different when we engage in pedagogies of hope. And then this all leading to action, again, wanting to make sure that we're moving towards action on climate change or other environmental issues. So those are the handrails. Those are the things to hold on to. The guardrails, to be aware of. Again, we do not want educational intervention to create more climate anxiety, if that can be avoided, while also recognizing that it is a valid response. We do not want to create opportunities to spread mis or disinformation, in the spirit of actually creating more digital literacies, media literacies, but not creating an opening for misinformation. And then false hope being a really interesting idea that kind of comes to this question of, well, optimism, different types of hope, techno-optimism. There could be certain positive ways of engaging with climate change that are actually disempowering of action. So kind of being aware of the line there. And then when we get to the lenses, again, these will be somewhat familiar echoes of, say, kind of sustainability competencies. So complexity being about systems and systems thinking, justice being about critical thinking and questioning who benefits, who's harmed. Perspectives, in one way being thinking about interdisciplinary perspectives, different ways of making sense of the world. Creativity, the space for kind of arts and culture to play an active role in this, beyond kind of more science-based approaches. And then empathy, just kind of seeing the world through the eyes of another. So these are the elements that kind of ended up coming through our synthesis and our discussions and our practice, and then kind of being turned into this visual metaphor in this diagram. There's something else I wanted to highlight in the model, because if you look at each of the handrails, you'll see that there's kind of words on the poles of them on either side. And that's indicating this, which each of these, there's a bit of a kind of productive tension. For example, on the action handrail, a familiar idea that's come up earlier today is that balance between individual action versus collective action. And in some ways, if you were to have a lesson around climate change, a module about climate change, there might be a complete absence of talking about action. You might say, oh, that's not my role in terms of supporting activism. We don't encourage that. We think you should be definitely engaging with action. But again, you could have a form of action integrated into it where there's an imbalance. You're overly focused on individual action, and so you're not engaging with the systems that need to be changed. And there could also be a possibility that you're overly focused on collective action and you're actually not bringing this back to something that's personal that people can do. So that productive tension we found on each of these, on honesty, again, it's honesty about the situation we're in, which is quite serious, and honesty about the solutions, which we have. Lean towards one of them and you're in doomism, lean towards the other, you're in techno-optimism. You kind of have to hold both of these at the same time. Awareness, it's about self-awareness, but awareness of the world around us, around our interrelationships with each other and the natural world. And then in holding a space, you're holding a space which is safe for us to be able to have difficult conversations, but also brave because it's leading towards action. Again, there's a tension there. You have to kind of do both. So before I hand it back to Cathy, I just wanted to kind of briefly share an example of how we think about kind of the layering of these elements. Knowing again that if you're designing a program or you're looking back on something you've taught, you can't do everything, but you can think about, well, what did I do well in that, or what could I kind of highlight a bit more if I wanted to lean into some of these questions. So in this diagram, we're kind of bringing out the idea that we'll start with the honesty handrail and make sure that we're talking about the truth about the problems and the solutions. And then we bring in the action handrail to layer on top of it to know that we actually also want to make sure that the way we're talking about the problems and solutions is empowering of individual and collective action. So it's leading to that action. And then you add a lens on top, and suddenly you're seeing it slightly differently. So if we bring in the complexity lens, now we're really thinking more about systems. It's a holistic systems thinking approach to, again, problem solution and individual collective action. And then bringing one more lens in, again, things get more complicated the more things you add, but if we bring in the justice lens, then we are thinking, we're asking questions about justice and power and who benefits and who's harmed. So again, it without the layering of these things, you might have a very different content that you engage with, very different educational activities you engage with. And so it's kind of an invitation to think about how these things relate to each other. And then the brief example I'll give before handing back to Cathy is Museum of Climate Hope. It was a project at Oxford working with our museums, gardens, and libraries, where we wanted objects on public display to tell stories about, across time and space, how different groups of people have expressed resilience, innovation, and transformation, and then use that as a basis for working with educators in primary school and secondary school. So because I don't have time, but we can put the link in if people are curious about exploring this more. And so with that example, I'll hand it over to Cathy to talk a little bit more about some of the background in terms of transformative learning that led to this work.
Brilliant, thank you, Bill. So this little section is really drawing together some of the underpinning theory around the hope wheel. And I've chosen the picture of the wonderful Paulo Freire. Wouldn't you love to have had a lesson from this smiling face? And his educational philosophy that looked at the real need, I think he called it an ontological need for an education and hope. So the fact that hope is really, really critical in engaging and empowering people, which I think Brad, our student provocateur, could probably put better than I've just put now. So central to this, one of the key things that a sort of key takeaway from the hope wheel is that emotion is a really important element to engage with, and one that is, you know, it's coming out in the literature, but we're dancing around it. It's nascent, and our understanding of how to apply that to pedagogy it is difficult sometimes to get a handle on. So Zambrara Ortiz talks about this idea of emotion, that emotion is a way of sort of driving us towards action. And very often in climate change education, we focus, or sustainability education, we focus on subject and content. It's reduced to a very small number of discipline areas, and it's primarily focused on the delivery and production and transfer of knowledge, whereas transformative learning and social and psychology principles tell us that this emotion is really critical to engaging. I think Teresa was talking about, you know, the heart of the head, heart and hands model. A second really important point to the hope wheel is this idea of questioning our kind of business as usual models, our growth thinking, individualism, inequality, exploitation, exclusion, all of these things that have led us to where we are now. Aaron Stibber talks about those being the stories that we live by. So part of transformative learning looks at reframing those narratives about disrupting and challenging transgressive learning, as it's called, a sort of subdivision of transformative learning around the stories we live by. And the aim of this, which again speaks to a lot of what was talked about in the breakout groups that I was in, is the ability to respond, what Stephen Sterling, our heavyweight educator, environmental educator, calls responsibility. Thanks, Bill. If I could have the next slide. So I thought it would be helpful to share this. Apologies if you've already come across it, but this explanation of transformative learning from Mezirow, often seen, Jacques Mezirow, often seen as the sort of father of transformative learning, not without his critiques, but it's really helpful because it speaks to these stories we live by asking us to look at those problematic frames of reference. And in terms of climate change and sustainability education, it's about asking questions around what are the mindsets, what are the habits of mind, the meaning perspectives that that frame this particular issue or this particular area. And the aim of that transformative learning is to make it more inclusive, as he says, discriminating, open, reflective, and critically, emotionally able to change. So this is the sort of paradigm change level of learning that transformative learning is aiming for. Thanks, Phil. So another model that's helpful is Stephen Sterling's. Again, if you haven't come across if you have come across this, apologies, but it was written back in 2001, but is still the clearest explanation of what transformative learning looks like and what the hope wheel hopes to embed in the pedagogy that it is championing. So Stephen talks about learning being in three different levels, the first order being the cognitive one, that head one, which is about effectiveness and efficiency. So the idea of kind of teaching and learning to do things better. Whereas the second order of change is a more metacognitive level that looks at doing better things. So examining assumptions and changing, looking at some of those inbuilt assumptions and reforming from the in. So going from conformative to reformative. But the kind of change that environmental education and education for sustainable development and all of those other educations talk about is this transformative learning. So that is really simply put as a way of engaging the learner to see things in a fundamentally different way, to bring around those changes that we need to see and to enable the transitions we need to make in such a very short space of time. Bill, I wonder if you could up to the next one. Thank you. So I thought it would be nice to share an example. There were questions before about, have you got any examples of how you embed these ideas? The Hope Wheel is quite, it synthesizes quite a lot of complex issues into a visual, but there's still, as Bill said, quite a lot in it. So I thought this might be helpful to give an outline of a course design and assessment on a foundation module at Brookes that I teach. It's a culture and communication module, and the students are invited to do a COIL project. And for those of you that aren't familiar with COIL, COIL stands for Collaborative Online International Learning. It doesn't trip off the tongue, but it's essentially where you get groups of students, small groups of students, 4 or 5, to collaborate with students in another institution in another country. So for us, we're working with a university in Perm in Russia and in Grenoble. And these students work on an issue of social or environmental significance that they select. And they then, as it says in the title there, they research it, they reflect on it, they relate with their other group, and they report back on it. So part of that process involves understanding other perspectives, looking at things from an intercultural perspective, because they're working with intercultural groups. In the instance of Ecocide, for example, where they explore the Ecocide campaign that is campaigning to make damage to the natural environment a crime in the international criminal courts, they look at how that is approached in their distinct geographical locations, and they compare and contrast campaigns and popularity and so on. The framing for these comes very much out of questions prompted by the lenses. So they look at the language, for example, used to frame the environment. So for example, phrases like ecosystem services tells us something about how we are framing nature in that position. Or in business, perhaps, nature referred to as negative externalities, for example. The lens a story about how we see ourselves and our position in the natural world and what those relationships are. So they look at environmental rights or social rights, and they look at human interconnections. So how humans, what is the implication of our behaviors and our actions? And then finally, they create a leaflet for a campaign on their particular issue. And they do that with their other group, and then they feed that back to the class at the end of the semester. So there, those, they're finding out some hard truths that we talk about, the honesty element of the honesty handrail. They're looking at self-awareness. How might they contribute to plastic pollution, or how might they be implicated with their actions and their behaviors? It holds a space for being able to discuss things in a safe environment. It's very scaffolded. They're provided with protocols and ways of talking about things, but also encouraging them to be brave and to think about solutions. So that's just a really brief whistle stop of this one activity. But I hope it's given you a little bit of an idea of how you might use the Hope Wheel in a particular module or course to embed some of those core principles. And I guess to sort of conclude my section is really around these two things came out for us really strongly through this research. And the first one was this emotional engagement that, you know, as Brad was saying earlier, is really challenging. It can disengage, but it's also, we feel really, and from the literature, is really critical to engaging students in a meaningful way that can promote that emotion, that can promote positive action and a hopeful response to it. So Bill, back to you there, I think.
Yeah, I just have a few things to leave you with, and I think, Liz, we don't have time to continue because we're at the lunch break, aren't we? But what I wanted to leave you with was a quote from Joanna Macy around active hope. Again, hope being a practice, not just a feeling, but an invitation to act, and also an invitation to kind of take stock of, you know, where we are, what you want, and how you're going to get there. If you don't know the work that reconnects, it's actually a brilliant process of starting with what you appreciate, what you love, honoring your pain, acknowledging loss, then seeing with new eyes, and then taking action. And, you know, maybe the question to leave you with, you don't have to put it in the chat, but, you know, what are you grateful for? What do you love? What grounds you in this work? And then also, what are you worried about losing or having to give up, having to relinquish in this time of change? And again, creating a space where you as an educator can answer these questions, but also maybe where your students could as well. And then just so you know, in the slides, you can see our article and poster related to this work, and we have our contact details and a few references of kind of what influenced us. So again, thank you very much for including us in the program today.